last living witness to Emmett Till's abduction, finally reveals his story. He was just a child when he witnessed one of America's most notorious crimes. Decades of silence followed, until now. This is the story he's kept hidden for a lifetime. For nearly 70 years, one man carried the secret of what really happened the night Emmett Till was taken. Now, the last living witness is breaking his silence. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're watching from on comments section. I pray may the good God Almighty bless and preserve you all and your family. Amen. Let's begin. The rain hammered against the window of the small nursing homeroom in Memphis, Tennessee, each drop a reminder of tears that should have been shed decades ago. Elijah Montgomery sat in his wheelchair, his weathered hands trembling, not from age, though he had plenty of that at 93 years old, but from the weight of a secret he'd carried for 68 years. Outside, the world had changed. A black president had served 2 terms. Civil rights monuments stood where lynch mobs once gathered. Schools were integrated. Laws were passed. But inside Elijah's chest, in the deepest chambers of his heart, it was still August 28, 1955, and he was still that terrified 12-year-old boy hiding in the cotton field, watching something no child should ever witness. The reporter sitting across from him, Jasmine Williams, couldn't have been more than 30. She had kind eyes, the kind that seemed to understand suffering even if she hadn't lived through his particular brand of hell. Her recorder sat on the table between them like a confession booth made of plastic and microchips. "Mr. Montgomery," she said softly, "you don't have to do this if you're not ready." Elijah's laugh was bitter, like chicory coffee left too long on the stove. "Ready? Child, I've been not ready for almost 7 decades. But ready or not, these bones are tired, and this story—" He paused, his voice cracking like old leather. "This story deserves to breathe before I take my last breath." Before Elijah could speak about that night, he had to go back further, to the boy he was before the world taught him that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. The Mississippi Delta in 1955 was a place of contradictions. The land was rich, dark soil that could grow cotton tall as a man's chest. But the people who worked that land lived in poverty that would break your heart. The sky stretched endless and blue, promising freedom, while Jim Crow laws wrapped around black folks' lives like barbed wire. Elijah's family lived on the Johnson plantation, though lived was perhaps too generous a word. They existed there, in a shotgun shack with gaps in the walls wide enough to see through and a roof that leaked more than it sheltered. His father, Abraham Montgomery, worked the fields from sunup to sundown for wages that barely covered their weekly credit at the plantation store. His mother, Ruby, took in washing from white families in town, her hands perpetually raw from lye soap and hot water. But Elijah, Eli, as everyone called him then, Eli had something his parents had long ago surrendered: hope. He was small for 12, barely 5 feet tall, with knobby knees and arms like tree branches. But his mind was sharp, sharper than the segregated school system wanted it to be. He read everything he could get his hands on, discarded newspapers, old books, even the back of seed packets. His mother said he had the gift of hunger, not for food, though there was plenty of that kind of hunger too, but hunger for knowledge, for understanding, for a world bigger than the one that had been prescribed for him. That summer, Eli had a cousin visiting from Chicago. Emmett Till was 14, but he seemed older, more confident, more alive than the boys who had grown up under the crushing weight of Mississippi's racial hierarchy. Emmett, Bobo, his family called him, had a stutter that made him self-conscious, but when he relaxed, when he felt safe, he could talk about anything. He told stories about Chicago, about riding the streetcars, about going to movies and theaters where you could sit anywhere you wanted, about a world where a black boy could walk down the street without stepping off the sidewalk when a white person approached. "You ever been to Chicago, Eli?" Bobo asked one evening as they sat on the porch steps, lightning bugs blinking in the gathering dusk. "Never been nowhere but right here," Eli admitted, feeling the smallness of his world acutely in that moment. You should come visit. It ain't perfect. Ain't nowhere perfect for folks like us. But man, it's different. You can breathe there, you know. Bobo's eyes were bright with the enthusiasm of someone who had seen beyond the horizon. Eli's mother had overheard from inside the house. She came to the screen door, her face tight with worry. Emmett, baby, you need to understand something. Things ain't the same here as they are up north. You got to be careful. You got to remember where you are. Bobo nodded, but Eli could see he didn't really understand. How could he? Chicago was a different world, and Bobo hadn't grown up with the constant weight of fear that pressed down on every black person in Mississippi like humidity before a storm. 3 days later, Eli would understand why his mother's warning had carried such urgency. 3 days later, everything would change. Money Store in Money, Mississippi, was the kind of place that served as the heart of the small black community. It was owned by Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Millam, white men who treated their black customers with a particular brand of Southern courtesy that masked contempt. You could buy goods on credit there, though the interest rates kept families in perpetual debt. You could cash a check, buy a soda, pick up supplies for the week. On August 24, 1955, a group of young people drove to the store. Eli was with them, squeezed into the back of his uncle's truck with his cousins and Bobo. They were buying sodas and candy with the few pennies they'd earned picking cotton that week, a small pleasure in a life that offered precious few. What happened next has been debated, twisted, mythologized, and weaponized for decades. The historical record is clear on certain facts, muddy on others. But Eli was there. Eli saw everything, even the parts he wished he hadn't. They went into the store, the wooden floor creaking under their feet. Carolyn Bryant was behind the counter, a white woman in her 20s who handled transactions with mechanical efficiency. Bobo, being from Chicago, didn't have the reflexive fear that Mississippi-raised black children had been taught since they could walk. He was friendly, maybe too friendly by Mississippi standards. He bought some candy. What was said, what transpired, Eli couldn't entirely make out from where he stood near the door. But he saw Carolyn's face change. He saw her stiffen. He saw the way she moved toward the back of the store. And he felt the temperature in the room drop, as if someone had opened a window in winter. "We need to go," Eli's cousin Maurice whispered urgently. "Now." They left quickly, piling back into the truck. Bobo seemed confused by the sudden urgency, still holding his candy, still smiling that open Chicago smile that didn't understand it was in mortal danger. "What happened?" Bobo asked. "What's wrong? You don't talk to white women like that," Maurice said, his voice sharp with fear. "Not here. Never here." "I didn't do nothing," Bobo protested. Doesn't matter what you did or didn't do," Eli's uncle said from the driver's seat, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Doesn't matter truth. Only matters what she says happened, what they believe happened." The ride back was silent except for the rattle of the truck and the thundering of Eli's heart. He had a sinking feeling, the kind his grandmother called a visitation, when your spirit knows something terrible is coming even before your mind can name it. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He lay on his pallet on the floor, staring at the ceiling, listening to his parents' worried whispers from their room. He heard his father say, "We should send the boy back to Chicago. Tonight." But before could mean so many things, and all of them were terrifying. 4 days passed. For days of summer heat and field work and the illusion that maybe, just maybe, nothing would come of the incident at the store. Eli wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that the world wasn't as cruel as the stories whispered in the quarters, that justice existed somewhere beyond the cotton fields, that a 14-year-old boy would be safe, that he was wrong. August 28, 1955. The night was oppressively hot, the kind of heat that made your skin stick to itself and turned sleep into a shallow, restless thing. Eli had been staying with his uncle's family, sleeping on the porch where there was at least the hope of a breeze. Bobo was inside, sharing a bed with Eli's cousins at approximately 2:30 in the morning. The sound of a truck pulling up the dirt road shattered the night's fragile peace. Eli woke instantly, his body understanding danger before his mind fully caught up. He heard men's voices, White men's voices, rough and purposeful. "Where's that boy? The one that did the talking?" Eli's blood turned to ice. He rolled off the porch, crawling on his belly toward the side of the house, moving on pure instinct. Years later, he would wonder what made him hide instead of running inside to warn them. But in that moment, his body made the choice for him. Some ancient survival mechanism understood that there was nothing a 12-year-old boy could do against armed white men except die alongside whatever target they'd come for. From his hiding spot beneath the house, squeezed between the cinder blocks that lifted the structure a few feet off the ground, Eli had a partial view of the front yard. He saw Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, the men from the store. He saw at least one other man. They had pistols and flashlights. The door to the house burst open. They didn't knock, didn't wait for permission. Eli heard his Uncle Moses Wright pleading, his voice cracking with terror and helplessness. "Please, sir, please. He's just a boy. He's from up north. He don't know our ways. Please don't take him." "That's exactly the problem," one of the men said, his voice cold as December rain. "You niggers from up north come down here thinking you can do whatever you want. Talk to our women. Forget your place." He didn't mean nothing by it. Moses continued, and Eli could hear the tears in his voice, could picture his uncle literally begging for his nephew's life. "He's just a child, old enough to talk fresh, old enough to face consequences." Then Eli heard Bobo's voice, confused and frightened. "What's happening? Uncle Mose? What's going on? Son, these men." Moses couldn't finish the sentence. "Are you the boy from Chicago? The one that did the talking at the store?" Millam's voice was almost casual, as if he were asking about the weather. I didn't do nothing wrong, sir. That ain't what Ms. Bryant says. Now you coming with us, or we gotta get difficult." Eli's grandmother had always said, his grandmother, Bobo's great-grandmother too, had always said, there are some things worse than death in this world. Lying there in the dirt, Eli began to understand what she meant. The choice Bobo faced wasn't between going and staying. It was between going with some shred of dignity or being dragged out, making it worse for everyone left behind. "I'll come," Bobo said quietly. "Just don't hurt my family." Eli watched through the gaps in the foundation as they led Bobo out. The boy's white t-shirt seemed to glow in the darkness. He wasn't wearing shoes. Eli would remember that detail for the rest of his life, that Bobo was barefoot, vulnerable, walking towards something unthinkable in his bare feet, like some kind of sacrifice. Moses Wright followed them out into the yard. "Please, sirs, please. He's Mamie's only child. She's a widow. Please, just let him go. I'll make sure he leaves Mississippi. Tonight. You'll never see him again." "That's right," Millam said, almost cheerful now. "We'll make sure of that." They loaded Bobo into the back of their truck. Millam got in beside him, and Eli saw the glint of a pistol in his hand. As the truck began to pull away, Eli heard Bobo's voice, small and scared. "Uncle Mose? Uncle Mose, what's happening?" But Mose is right. That brave man who would later do the impossible by testifying against white men in a Mississippi courtroom could only stand in his yard and watch his nephew disappear into the darkness. The truck drove away. The sound of the engine faded. The night closed back over everything like water over a drowning man, and Eli, lying in the dirt, realized he had wet himself. He was shaking so hard his teeth rattled. But he couldn't move. He was paralyzed by a terror so profound it rewrote his understanding of what it meant to be human, to be black, to be powerless. But the night wasn't finished with Eli Montgomery yet. What happened next would haunt him until his last breath. Chapter 4. The W.S. couldn't say exactly what made him follow. Maybe it was the same curiosity that made him read every scrap of written word he could find. Maybe it was shock, his mind unable to process what had just happened and seeking to understand by seeing more. Or maybe, and this is what he would wonder about most over the decades, maybe some part of him knew that witness was important, that someone needed to see and remember. He crawled out from under the house. The yard was empty now except for his uncle, who had collapsed on the ground, his shoulders shaking with sobs. His aunt was in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her body together. Eli's younger cousins were crying inside the house. Eli should have gone to them, should have stayed. But instead, his legs started moving, carrying him into the cotton field that stretched behind the house. He knew these fields intimately, every row, every irrigation ditch, every path through the tall plants. He'd been working them since he was old enough to carry a sack. The truck had gone toward the Tallahatchie River. Eli knew the area, knew the old barn that sat about a mile away, near the river's edge. He moved through the cotton like a ghost, his slight frame slipping between rows, his bare feet silent on the earth. He told himself he was just going to see where they went. He told himself he'd turn back any minute. He told himself a lot of lies that night, but his feet kept moving forward, drawn by something larger than logic or self-preservation. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows. Eli used those shadows, moving from tree to ditch to cotton row, getting closer to the barn. He could hear voices now, rough and angry, punctuated by sounds he didn't want to identify as he reached the tree line near the barn. The old structure was barely standing, its roof mostly gone, walls with gaps wide enough to see through. There was a truck parked outside, the same one that had taken Bobo. Eli climbed a sweet gum tree at the edge of the clearing. The branches were thick with leaves, enough to hide him. From his perch, about 15 feet off the ground, he had a clear view into the barn. What he saw in the next hours would break something fundamental in his soul. There are things human language was never meant to describe. The torture of Emmett Till was one of those things. Eli watched. God help him. He watched, because something kept him frozen in that tree, some terrible sense that witness was necessary, that someone had to see and remember and carry the truth forward even if it destroyed them in the process. They beat him. They beat that 14-year-old boy with a kind of methodical cruelty that spoke to something deeper than anger, deeper than vengeance for some perceived slight. They beat him for being alive, for being black, for having the audacity to forget, even for a moment, the unwritten rules that governed black existence in Mississippi. "You think you better than us, boy?" Milam's voice carried across the night air. "You think because you from up north you can come down here and talk to our women however you want?" "I didn't do nothing," Bobo kept saying, his voice getting weaker. "Please, I didn't do nothing. Don't lie to me, boy." Eli wanted to close his eyes, but he couldn't. He wanted to run, but his muscles wouldn't obey. He wanted to scream, to do something, anything, but he was 12 years old, and alone and more terrified than he'd ever been in his short life. Hours passed. Eli lost track of time. At some point, they dragged Bobo outside. They had a cotton gin fan with them, a heavy metal piece of equipment used to process cotton. Eli watched them tie it to Bobo with barbed wire. "This is what happens," Bryant said, "when you forget your place." They loaded Bobo, barely conscious now, his face so swollen that Eli couldn't recognize him, back into the truck. Then they drove toward the river. Eli climbed down from the tree on trembling legs. Every instinct screamed at him to run the other way, to go home, to never speak of what he'd seen. But instead, he followed. He had to see the end. He had to be the witness. At the Tallahatchie River, under the indifferent stars and the moon that illuminated everything with its cold, impartial light, they threw Emmett Till's body into the dark water. The weight of the cotton gin fan pulled him down. The ripples spread across the surface and then disappeared, as if nothing had disturbed the water at all. The men stood on the bank for a moment, smoking cigarettes, talking in low voices about covering their tracks, about what they'd say if anyone asked. Then they got back in the truck and drove away. Eli stood hidden in the rushes at the river's edge for a long time after they left. He couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't process what he'd witnessed. His mind had fractured into pieces, and he didn't know how to put them back together. Finally, as dawn began to break over the delta, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscene given what had just happened, Eli walked back to his uncle's house. Each step felt like wading through deep water. Each breath hurt his lungs. When he got back, his uncle was sitting on the porch steps, his face gray with shock and grief. He looked up as Eli approached, and something in the boy's eyes made him go pale. "Where you been, Eli?" Moses asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I followed them," Eli said. The words felt like stones in his mouth. I saw everything. Moses grabbed Eli's shoulders, his grip almost painful. Listen to me, boy. You didn't see nothing. You hear me? Nothing. You weren't there. You don't know nothing about this. But Uncle Mose, no. Moses shook him slightly, tears streaming down his face. You tell anyone what you saw, and they'll kill you too. They'll kill your mama and your daddy. They'll kill me and your aunt and your cousins. You understand? Some truths will get you killed in Mississippi. Eli understood. God help him. He understood perfectly. 3 days later, Emmett Till's body surfaced in the Tallahatchie River. A young boy fishing found it, swollen and decomposed beyond recognition, except for his mother's ring still on his finger. The gin fan had kept it down for a while, but the river had decided to give up its secret. The news spread through the black community like wildfire. Eli heard the adults talking in hushed, urgent voices. He heard his mother crying in the kitchen, a sound that tore at his heart. He heard his father's fury, carefully contained because expressing it could get him killed. Sheriff H.C. Strider came around asking questions. He talked to Moses Wright, who testified, with incredible courage, that Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam had taken Emmett from his house that night. But when Strider asked if anyone else saw anything, if there were any other witnesses, Moses looked the sheriff directly in the eye and said, "No, sir. Just me." Eli, sitting in the corner of the room, felt his uncle's words like a physical blow. He wanted to stand up, to shout that he'd seen everything, that he could tell them exactly what happened, where it happened, how it happened. But Moses caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of his head, and Eli understood. Testimony could get him killed. The truth was too dangerous. Mamie Till Bradley, Emmett's mother, made the decision that would change the course of American history. She demanded an open casket funeral. She wanted the world to see what they'd done to her baby boy. The images of Emmett's mutilated face would appear in Jet magazine, in newspapers across the country, shocking the conscience of a nation that preferred not to look too closely at Southern racial violence. Eli's mother wouldn't let him see the pictures. She hid that issue of Jet magazine, but Eli found it anyway. He stared at the photograph for a long time, though it bore little resemblance to the laughing boy who had talked about Chicago just days before. This was what hate looked like. This was what racism looked like. This was the price of forgetting your place, the cost of being black in Mississippi in 1955. That the trial was a mockery of justice. Eli's uncle Moses Wright did the impossible. He stood up in that courtroom full of white people and pointed at Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam and identified them as the men who had taken Emmett. It was the bravest thing Eli had ever seen. Moses's life was effectively over in Mississippi after that testimony. He'd broken the ultimate taboo. A black man had accused white men in open court, but bravery wasn't enough. The all-white jury deliberated for 67 minutes, and later said they would have returned quicker if they hadn't stopped to have a soda. Not guilty on all counts, Bryant and Millam walked free. They even gave an interview to Look magazine a few months later, admitting everything, describing the kidnapping and murder in detail. Double jeopardy meant they couldn't be tried again. They could confess to the whole world, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Eli listened to the adults rage and weep and despair. But he couldn't tell them what made it even worse, that there had been another witness, that he had seen it all, that the truth lived in him like a tumor, growing and metastasizing, poisoning everything it touched. His parents, sensing something was deeply wrong with their son, decided to send him to his aunt's house in Chicago. Get him out of Mississippi, away from the memories, give him a chance to heal. But you can't outrun what you carry inside you. Eli learned that lesson the hard way. Chicago was everything Bobo had said it would be and nothing at all like Eli expected. The city was massive, overwhelming, loud, dirty, and blessedly indifferent. No one cared about the color of his skin in quite the same way they did in Mississippi. There were still plenty of racism. Redlining kept black families in certain neighborhoods. Job discrimination was rampant. Schools were segregated in practice, if not by law. But you could walk down a sidewalk without stepping aside for white people. You could ride the bus and sit wherever there was a seat. You could look a white person in the eye without worrying about being killed for it. Eli's Aunt Gladys lived in a small apartment on the south side. She worked as a nurse and had carved out a decent life for herself. She was kind but busy, often working double shifts. Eli attended a local school where he was behind his peers academically. The segregated Mississippi school system had failed him in every measurable way. But he was hungry to learn, and his teachers recognized something in him worth nurturing. But the nightmares wouldn't stop. Every night, Eli dreamed of that barn, that river, Bobo's voice asking, "Uncle Mose, what's happening?" He dreamed of the sweet gum tree and the sound of fists hitting flesh and the splash as the body hit the water. He woke up shaking, sweating, sometimes screaming. Aunt Gladys tried to get him to talk about it. "Baby, you got to let it out. You got to tell someone what's hurting you." But how could he explain? How could he find words for the thing that lived inside him, coiled around his heart like barbed wire? And more than that, how could he admit that he'd hidden, that he'd watched, that he'd done nothing to help? The guilt was as heavy as the trauma, and the two were so tangled together he couldn't separate them. At school, Eli was quiet, withdrawn. He threw himself into books with an intensity that worried his teachers. He read about the Civil War, about Reconstruction, about the rise of Jim Crow. He read about lynchings and race riots and the systematic dismantling of Black progress after emancipation. He was trying to understand how the world could be so broken, how human beings could do what he'd witnessed in that barn. In his English class, his teacher, Mrs. Washington, noticed him and took a special interest. She was a young Black woman, passionate about literature and civil rights, and she saw something in Eli's haunted eyes that called to her. "You're carrying something heavy," she said to him one day after class. "I can see it in the way you walk, like you're holding up the whole world on those skinny shoulders." Eli shrugged, not trusting himself to speak. "You know what James Baldwin said?" Mrs. Washington continued. "He said, 'Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.' Whatever you're carrying, baby, you're going to have to face it eventually, or it's going to eat you alive from the inside out." She was right, of course, but Eli wasn't ready. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The years passed. Eli became Elijah, a young man, then a man in his prime, then a middle-aged man, then an old man. Each decade layered new experiences over the old trauma, but it never truly buried it. The memory sat at the bottom of his consciousness like sediment at the bottom of a river, stirred up at unexpected moments. That he served in Vietnam, where the violence and death paradoxically helped in some ways. At least in war, everyone knew that horror was the point. At least in combat, the enemy wore a uniform and carried a weapon. Not like Mississippi, where terror wore a smile and called itself civilization. After the war, he went to college on the GI Bill, the first person in his family to attend university. He studied history, thinking maybe if he understood the past, he could make sense of what he'd witnessed. He wrote papers about Reconstruction and the Compromise of 1877 and the systematic abandonment of Black Americans by the federal government. His professors praised his work for its passion and insight, never knowing that passion came from a well of trauma so deep it had no bottom. He became a teacher himself, working in Chicago public schools, trying to give young Black kids the education he'd never gotten in Mississippi. He married a woman named Lorraine, kind and patient, who loved him despite the nightmares that never quite went away, despite the way he sometimes went silent and distant, lost in a past he couldn't share. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Elijah loved them fiercely, protectively, with an intensity that sometimes frightened him. Every time his son went out after dark, Elijah fought down panic. Every time his daughters dealt with racism or discrimination, Elijah felt the old rage bubbling up, barely contained. "You okay, baby?" Lorraine would ask, finding him sitting in the dark, staring out the window at nothing. "Just thinking," he'd say. "About what?" "The past. Ancient history." She knew there was something he wasn't telling her, some wound that had never healed. But she didn't push. You don't stay married for 40 years without learning when to push and when to let someone keep their secrets. The civil rights movement happened. Elijah watched from a distance, proud and terrified in equal measure. He saw the marches, the sit-ins, the freedom riders, and the Birmingham children. He watched Martin Luther King Jr. give his "I Have a Dream" speech and felt tears streaming down his face, though he couldn't have said if they were tears of hope or grief or some combination of both. When Medgar Evers was assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi, in 1963, Elijah had a breakdown. He locked himself in the bathroom and sobbed so hard he vomited. Lorraine called his aunt, and together they got him through it. But neither of them understood what had triggered such an intense reaction. When the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, Elijah felt a complicated mix of triumph and bitterness. Progress was being made, but Emmett Till would never vote. Emmett Till would never grow up, never marry, never have children, never see the world change. The boy from Chicago who had loved life so much it overflowed into every conversation. He was gone, erased, reduced to a photograph in Jet magazine and a footnote in civil rights textbooks. Over the years, Elijah followed the news about the Till case with obsessive attention. In 2004, the Department of Justice reopened the investigation. Elijah's hands shook as he read the news article. They were exhuming Emmett's body, doing an autopsy with modern forensic techniques, trying to build a case that could finally bring justice. In 2007, a grand jury declined to indict anyone. Carolyn Bryant, Carolyn Donham now, was still alive, living quietly in North Carolina. The men who had actually committed the murder were long dead. Roy Bryant died of cancer in 1994. J.W. Millam died in 1980. Both went to their graves never facing consequences for what they'd done. Elijah wanted to scream. He wanted to go to the FBI and tell them everything he'd seen, describe every moment in perfect detail, because those images were seared into his brain like they'd been burned there with a brand. But what good would it do? The murderers were dead. The witnesses were dead. Moses Wright had died in 1977. Mamie Till Mobley had died in 2003. Her life's work dedicated to ensuring her son's death meant something. And Elijah was the last one left who truly knew what had happened that night. The last living witness to the whole terrible truth. By 2020, Elijah had lost almost everything. Lorraine died in 2015, her heart giving out gently in her sleep. The kind of death he wished everyone could have, surrounded by love, no pain, just slipping from one state of being to another. His children were grown with families of their own, living in different cities, caught up in their own lives. He didn't begrudge them that. That's what you wanted for your children, for them to have better, easier lives than you did. He moved into a nursing home in Memphis, choosing that city because it felt close enough to Mississippi to be meaningful, but far enough away to be safe. The staff was kind. The food was decent. His room had a window that looked out on a small garden where birds came to feed. It could have been worse, but the secret he'd carried for 65 years was getting heavier. Or maybe he was getting weaker. Either way, the burden was becoming too much, and he started writing things down, trying to purge the memories onto paper. His handwriting was shaky now, but the words came clear and sharp. He described the cotton fields and the sweet gum tree and the barn and the river. He described Bobo's face before and the thing that was in the water after. He described the sounds and the smells and the way the moonlight had made everything seem unreal, like a nightmare except he was awake. He was there. He was seeing it all. When he finished, he had 47 pages of testimony that would never be admitted in any court of law. He sealed it in an envelope and gave it to his oldest daughter, Clara. "What's this, Daddy?" she asked. "Something I need you to keep safe," he said. "Something I couldn't talk about while I was alive, but that needs to be known after I'm gone." Clara looked at the envelope, sensing its weight. "Is this about, did something happen to you?" "Not to me," Elijah said. "But I saw something happen. Long time ago, before you were born, before I met your mother. Something I should have spoken about and didn't because I was scared, and then I was ashamed of being scared, and then too much time had passed, and I didn't know how to start. You can tell me now, Daddy." But he couldn't. Even then, after all those years, the words stuck in his throat like fish bones. Jasmine Williams stumbled onto Elijah's story almost by accident. She was a journalist working for a podcast series about cold civil rights cases, following up on rumors and leads that had gone nowhere. Someone mentioned in passing that there was an old man in a Memphis nursing home who might have information about Emmett Till, but it was probably nothing. Probably just another old-timer whose memory was mixing up different events. But Jasmine believed in following every lead, no matter how tenuous. That's how you found the stories that mattered. So she drove to Memphis, found the nursing home, and asked to speak with Elijah Montgomery. He agreed to see her, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because she was young and earnest and reminded him of his students from all those years ago. Maybe because he was 93 and tired and the secret had become unbearable. Maybe because he'd been waiting for someone to ask the right questions for 68 years. Mr. Montgomery, Jasmine said when they first met, I understand you lived in Mississippi in the 1950s. I'm researching the Emmett Till case, and I was told you might have some memories from that time. Elijah studied her face. She had her grandmother's eyes, a woman who had marched with King, who had sat at lunch counters in Nashville, who had been arrested 4 times before she was 25. Jasmine didn't know that Elijah could see her lineage in her face, that he recognized the particular kind of courage that runs in families. What makes you think I know anything? He asked. Because you were there, Jasmine said simply. You were 12 years old. You were Emmett's cousin, and you disappeared from the historical record after the trial. No interviews, no statements, nothing. Most people assumed you died or moved away and wanted to forget. But forgetting and not talking aren't the same thing, are they? Elijah felt something crack inside his chest. This woman had done her homework. She'd connected dots that others had missed or ignored. No, he said quietly. They aren't the same thing at all. Will you tell me your story? And so it began. Jasmine came back every day for a week, then twice a week for months. She brought her recorder and her notebook and her infinite patience. She asked gentle questions and sat through long silences. She didn't push when Elijah needed to stop, didn't rush when he was ready to continue. Slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a dam, the story came out. The hardest part, Elijah told Jasmine during their 4th session, wasn't seeing what they did to him. I mean, it was hard, don't get me wrong. It broke something in me that never got fixed. But the hardest part was coming home afterward and having my uncle tell me I couldn't say anything. Having my own family tell me that the truth was too dangerous. You were protecting them, Jasmine said. And they were protecting you. I know that. I understand it. But understanding doesn't make it easier. For 68 years, I've carried this story. I've been the only person alive who saw the whole thing, from start to finish. The only witness to the complete truth. And I stayed silent. You were 12 years old, Jasmine reminded him gently. A child. In one of the most dangerous places in America for Black people. You were terrorized into silence. But I wasn't 12 forever, Elijah said, his voice breaking. I became a man. I had opportunities. I could have come forward in the 60s when the movement was strong. I could have testified when they reopened the case in 2004. But I didn't. I kept my mouth shut and let the murderers die without ever having to face what I saw. Jasmine was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Can I tell you something my grandmother told me? She said that every person who lived through Jim Crow carries wounds that never fully heal. She said that judging the survival strategies of people who lived through that time is like judging someone for how they screamed while being tortured. Surviving was resistance. Living long enough to tell the story, even if it took decades, was resistance. Elijah wept. He couldn't help it. The tears came from some deep well he'd been holding back for most of a century. Over the following months, Elijah gave Jasmine every detail he could remember. She recorded it all, taking meticulous notes, asking clarifying questions, treating his testimony with the respect it deserved. He described the layout of the barn, the make and model of the truck, the clothes the men were wearing. He described the exact location where they threw the body into the Tallahatchie River. He described the cotton gin fan tied with barbed wire, the way it sank beneath the dark water, taking Emmett with it. He described things that weren't in the official record, details that only someone who was there could know. The fact that there had been a 4th man, someone younger, maybe in his early 20s, who had stayed mostly in the background, but who had been there. Elijah had never been able to identify him, but he remembered his face, remembered the way he'd looked sick, like he wanted to leave but didn't have the courage to walk away. He described the moment when Emmett had stopped begging, when something in the boy had broken and he'd gone silent. That silence had been worse than the crying, worse than the pleading. It was the silence of someone who understood they were going to die and there was nothing they could do to stop it. "I've read everything written about that night," Jasmine told him. Police reports, court transcripts, the Look magazine confession, books, articles, dissertations. But I've never heard some of these details. The fourth man, the specific location, the timeline you're describing. Because I'm the only one who saw it all, Elijah said. Moses saw them take Emmett. Other people saw them driving around that night. But I followed them. I watched the whole thing. And then I spent 68 years trying to forget what I couldn't forget. Why now? Jasmine asked. Why are you telling me now? Elijah looked out the window at the bird feeder. A cardinal was perched there, bright red against the gray winter sky. Because I'm dying, he said simply. Cancer. They tell me I got maybe 6 months, maybe a year if I'm lucky and treatment works. And I realize that if I die with this story still inside me, then I'm no better than the people who covered it up. I'm complicit in the silence. And I won't, let that be my legacy. Not everyone in Elijah's family was happy about his decision to speak out. His son Marcus came to visit, his face tight with worry and anger. Dad, why are you doing this? Why now? Those people are dead. The ones who killed Emmett Till, they're all dead. What's the point of dredging this up? The point, Elijah said, his voice stronger than it had been in months, is truth. The point is that someone needs to know the whole story. But what about us? Marcus demanded. What about our family? What happens when this comes out and people start asking questions? What happens when white supremacists start sending threats? Same thing that's always happened, Elijah said. We survive. We endure. We don't let fear silence us. His daughter Clara was more supportive but still worried. Daddy, are you sure you're ready for this? Once this story is out there, you can't take it back. You'll be known as the Emmett Till witness for whatever time you have left. Is that what you want? I don't want it, Elijah said. But I need it. I need to say these words out loud before I die. I need someone to hear them and write them down and make sure they're part of the historical record. Because this isn't just my story, it's Bobo's story. And he deserves for the full truth to be known. His youngest daughter, Patricia, came and sat with him for hours, just holding his hand. I'm proud of you, Daddy, she said. I know this is hard. I know you're scared. But I'm proud of you for having the courage to speak. It's not courage, Elijah said. Courage would have been speaking up in 1955. This is just an old man trying to make things right before he runs out of time. Better late than never, Patricia said. Elijah wanted to believe that. He desperately wanted to believe that late justice was still justice, that speaking truth after decades of silence still counted for something. But the guilt was a living thing inside him, and it wouldn't be quieted. In 2023, something happened that made Elijah's testimony even more urgent. Timothy Tyson, a historian, revealed that in 2008 he had interviewed Carolyn Bryant Donham, and she had recanted her testimony. She admitted that Emmett Till had never grabbed her, never made sexual advances, never done anything that justified what happened to him. She'd lied. She'd known she was lying. And her lie had gotten a 14-year-old boy tortured and murdered. When Elijah heard the news, he had another breakdown. Jasmine found him sobbing in his room, his frail body shaking with the force of his grief and rage. She knew, he kept saying. She knew all along, and she just lived her life. She got married, had children, grew old. And Bobo is still 14 years old at the bottom of that river. She's 90 now, Jasmine said. Living in Louisiana. The DA says there's not enough evidence to prosecute. I'm evidence, Elijah shouted, with more strength than Jasmine had heard from him before. I saw what happened. I can testify. Mr. Montgomery, Elijah, the men who killed him are dead. She can't be prosecuted for murder she didn't commit. She can only be prosecuted for the testimony she gave. Then prosecute her for that. She lied under oath. She's the reason those men walked free. She's the reason, his voice broke. She's the reason I've had to carry this for 68 years. But the legal system didn't work that way. The statute of limitations had run out. Carolyn Bryant Donham would never face criminal charges. She would die a free woman, her conscience apparently unburdened by the lies that had destroyed so many lives. This injustice galvanized Elijah in a way nothing else had. If the legal system wouldn't deliver justice, then at least the historical record would be complete. At least the world would know the full truth. He worked with Jasmine with renewed urgency. They went through every detail again, making sure everything was documented, recorded, verified as much as possible. Jasmine contacted historians and civil rights researchers. She gathered corroborating evidence, old maps that showed the exact layout Elijah described, property records that confirmed who owned the barn, newspaper clippings that mentioned details consistent with his account. AS News began to leak that a new witness had come forward in the Emmett Till case. The media attention was overwhelming. Reporters camped outside the nursing home. Elijah's children were harassed at work and home. Someone spray-painted racial slurs on Marcus's garage door, but there was also an outpouring of support. Civil rights organizations hailed Elijah's courage. Historians called his testimony a crucial piece of the historical puzzle. Emmett Till's family, distant cousins now, as Mamie and her generation were gone, reached out to thank him for finally speaking. Deborah Watts, Emmett Till's cousin, came to visit Elijah in person. She was in her 60s, a woman who had spent her life fighting to keep her cousin's memory alive. She sat beside Elijah's wheelchair and took his hands in hers. "Thank you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for carrying this burden for so long. Thank you for finally being able to share it." "I'm sorry," Elijah said. "I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner. I'm sorry I let the murderers die without facing what I saw." "You were a child," Deborah said firmly. "A terrified child in the most dangerous place in America. You have nothing to apologize for. The fact that you survived, that you're here now to tell the truth, that's what matters." But Elijah couldn't quite accept that absolution. The guilt was too deeply rooted. He'd lived with it so long it had become part of his identity. Jasmine's podcast, The Last Witness, the untold story of Emmett Till, was released in March 2024. 8 episodes, meticulously researched and produced, featuring Elijah's testimony, historical context, interviews with experts, and an examination of why some truths take decades to surface. The response was overwhelming. The podcast went to #1 on every platform. Major news outlets covered it. The New York Times wrote a feature. The Washington Post ran an editorial about the importance of late testimony. Think pieces proliferated about trauma, silence, and the cost of speaking truth in a society that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable facts. Some people questioned why Elijah had waited so long. "Convenient that he only comes forward after everyone's dead," wrote one cynic online. Where was this testimony when it could have actually mattered? These comments hurt Elijah more than he wanted to admit. Jasmine tried to shield him from the worst of the online discourse, but he saw enough to feel the sting of judgment from people who had never walked a day in his shoes, never known the particular terror of being a black child in Mississippi in 1955. But there were also letters, hundreds of them, then thousands, from people thanking him. From other survivors of racial violence who had kept silent out of fear. From children and grandchildren of civil rights activists who understood the impossible choices people had to make to survive. From teachers who were using his story to help students understand the complexity of history and trauma. One letter from a woman in South Carolina particularly moved him. She wrote, "My grandfather was lynched in 1949 for allegedly looking at a white woman. I never knew the details because everyone who witnessed it was too afraid to talk. You've helped me understand why he took that silence to his grave. Thank you for finding the courage to speak, even though it came late." Late testimony is still testimony. Late justice is still justice. HBO announced they were making a documentary based on Jasmine's podcast and Elijah's testimony. They wanted to interview him on camera, capture his story in his own words before it was too late. Elijah was 94 by this point, weakened by cancer treatments, but his mind was sharp. He agreed to the interviews. The filmmakers brought him back to Mississippi. It was the first time he'd been back since 1955. They drove him past his old family's land, now owned by someone else, the shotgun shack long since demolished. They took him to Money, Mississippi, to the site where Bryant's grocery had stood, also gone, replaced by nothing, just empty land. They took him to the Tallahatchie River. Elijah stood at the bank, or rather, sat in his wheelchair at the bank, and looked at the water. It looked peaceful, harmless, not like a place where history had been made, where innocents had been murdered, where the seeds of the civil rights movement had been planted in blood and grief. Right there, he said, pointing to a spot about 20 yards upstream. That's where they threw him in. I watched from over there, in those rushes. The rushes were different now, but the river was the same. Rivers outlast humans. Rivers remember even when people try to forget. The documentary crew filmed everything. Elijah talking about the cotton fields of his childhood. The barn, still standing, miraculously, though barely, where the worst of the violence had occurred. The sweet gum tree was gone, but Elijah showed them where it had been, where he'd climbed up and witnessed the unspeakable. How do you live with these memories? The director asked. You don't, Elijah said simply. They live with you. They take up residence in your bones and your blood, and you carry them until you die. And then maybe, if you're lucky and you've told the truth, they become part of the historical record instead of just a weight on one person's soul. In August 2024, on the 69th anniversary of Emmett Till's murder, the documentary premiered. The response was seismic. It reignited conversations about racial violence, about justice delayed, about the price of silence and the cost of speaking. Politicians weighed in. President Harris mentioned Elijah by name in a speech about civil rights and the ongoing need to confront America's racial history. Senators called for renewed efforts to pass anti-lynching legislation. The Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act had been passed in 2022, but some called for additional measures. Schools added Elijah's testimony to their curriculum. His story became part of how America taught its children about the civil rights era. Not just the triumphant marches and the inspiring speeches, but also the terror, the silence, the way trauma could keep people voiceless for decades. Carolyn Bryant Donham died in April 2023, before the documentary was released. She never faced legal consequences for her lies. But the historical record would forever show her complicity, her false testimony, her willingness to let a child die to protect her own reputation. Elijah had complicated feelings about her death. He'd hated her for most of his life, but the hate had curdled into something more complex over time. She was a monster, yes, but she was also a product of a monstrous system. She'd been taught that white womanhood needed protection from black masculinity, that lies were acceptable if they maintained social order, that black lives were fundamentally less valuable than white comfort. I can't forgive her, Elijah told Jasmine during one of their last interviews. I won't pretend to. She made choices, evil choices, that destroyed lives. But I also understand that she was raised in a system designed to make those choices seem normal, even necessary. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it helps me understand why she never showed remorse. To show remorse would be to admit that everything she'd been taught about race and power and hierarchy was a lie. And some people would rather die than admit that. By December 2024, Elijah was in hospice care. The cancer had spread everywhere it could go. The doctors said weeks, maybe days. His children gathered around his bedside. His grandchildren came. Even some great-grandchildren who were too young to understand but old enough to know this was important. Jasmine visited him one last time. She brought flowers, sunflowers, his favorite, and sat beside his bed holding his hand. "Did I do the right thing?" he asked her. His voice was barely a whisper now, each word an effort. Speaking out after all those years. "Yes," Jasmine said firmly. "You did the right thing. You told the truth. That's always the right thing, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. But it didn't bring justice. The murderers are all dead. Carolyn Bryant is dead. Nobody faced consequences. That's not on you," Jasmine said. "You didn't kill Emmett Till. You didn't lie about what happened. You were a child who witnessed something horrific and were traumatized into silence by a system designed to keep people like you quiet. The fact that you eventually found your voice, that matters. The fact that the historical record is now more complete because of you. That matters. Will people remember Bobo correctly now? Elijah asked. Will they know he was just a boy? Just a happy, excited boy who didn't understand how dangerous the world was. Yes, Jasmine promised. Because of you, they'll know. Because of your testimony, Emmett Till is more than just a photograph, more than just a symbol. He's a real person with a real story, and you've helped tell it. Elijah closed his eyes. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek. I wish I'd been brave enough to tell it sooner, he whispered. You were brave enough when it counted, Jasmine said. You were brave enough in the end. Elijah Montgomery died on January 15, 2025, exactly 70 years and 5 months after Emmett Till was murdered. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, family, friends, former students, civil rights activists, historians, and journalists who had been moved by his story. Reverend Jesse Jackson gave the eulogy. He spoke about courage and about the different forms it takes. About the courage to march, and the courage to sit at lunch counters, and the courage to speak truth even when your voice shakes, even when it comes decades late. Elijah Montgomery carried the weight of history on his shoulders for 68 years, Jackson said. He was just a child when he witnessed one of the most brutal crimes in American history. And he was terrorized into silence by a system that valued white supremacy over truth, over justice, over the life of a black child. For 68 years, he lived with that weight. And then, when he was 93 years old and dying of cancer, he found the strength to finally speak. That, my friends, is courage. That is what it means to seek redemption. That is what it means to serve truth, even at the end of your life. The funeral was covered by major media outlets. The New York Times obituary was lengthy and detailed. The Washington Post called him the last witness to civil rights history's most painful chapters. Time magazine named him one of the most important figures of 2024, but Elijah wouldn't have cared about any of that. What he would have cared about was that the story was told. That Emmett Till, Bobo, the happy boy from Chicago, was remembered not just as a victim or a symbol, but as a real person who had lived and laughed and dreamed before those dreams were stolen from him. In the months and years following Elijah's death, his testimony continued to have an impact. Historians used his account to fill in gaps in the historical record. The barn where Emmett Till had been tortured was preserved as a historical site, with Elijah's descriptions helping to create an accurate recreation of how it had looked that night. At a museum dedicated to Emmett Till's memory incorporated Elijah's testimony into its exhibits. Visitors could listen to audio recordings of his interviews, could see photographs of him at different ages, could understand the toll that silence had taken on his life. Educational curricula were updated to include not just the story of Emmett Till's murder, but also the story of Elijah Montgomery's testimony. Students learned about trauma and silence and the various forms that courage can take. They learned that speaking truth isn't always immediate, that sometimes people need time, years, even decades, to process horror before they can articulate it. Mental health professionals began using Elijah's story in their work with trauma survivors. They talked about delayed disclosure and the psychological barriers that prevent people from speaking about traumatic events. They discussed the ways systems of oppression use fear to enforce silence. They helped patients understand that healing can begin at any point, that it's never too late to speak your truth. Jasmine Williams won a Pulitzer Prize for her podcast. She wrote a book expanding on Elijah's testimony, providing additional context and historical analysis. The book became a bestseller, used in college courses on civil rights history, journalism, and American studies. But perhaps the most profound impact was on other witnesses, other people who had seen acts of racial violence and had been too afraid to speak. Elijah's story gave them permission to finally tell their own truths. An elderly woman in Alabama came forward with testimony about a lynching she'd witnessed in 1946. A man in Louisiana talked about his father's murder by police in 1963, an incident that had been ruled a suicide despite obvious evidence of foul play. A woman in Georgia described watching the Ku Klux Klan burn her family's home in 1968, naming names that had been whispered about, but never officially documented. The floodgates didn't fully open. Trauma and fear run deep, and many people would take their stories to their graves. But enough people spoke that a more complete picture of racial terrorism in America began to emerge. Not just the famous cases that everyone knew about, but the hundreds, thousands of smaller incidents that had been buried under layers of silence and fear. After Elijah's death, his daughter Clara went through his belongings at the nursing home. Among his things, she found a stack of letters he'd written but never sent. Letters to Emmett Till, written over the course of decades. Each one a piece of the conversation Elijah had been having in his head for 68 years. The earliest letter was dated August 1956, exactly 1 year after the murder. Dear Bobo, it's been a year. I thought maybe it would hurt less by now, but it doesn't. I think about you every day. I dream about you every night. I see your face, the way it was before, when you were smiling and talking about Chicago. I try not to see the other way, but sometimes I can't help it. Your mama was on the news again. She's still fighting, still making sure people know what happened to you. I wish I could help her. I wish I could tell her that I saw everything, that I could testify if it would do any good. But Uncle Mo says I have to stay quiet. He says they'd kill me too. I think he's right. I'm sorry, Bobo. I'm sorry I hid. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I'm still here and you're not. Your cousin, Eli. There were letters from his 20s, after Vietnam. Dear Bobo, I've seen death now. Lots of it. Young men dying in rice paddies, their blood mixing with mud and rain. I thought maybe it would make sense of what happened to you, seeing death in war, where at least everyone knows that killing is the point. But it didn't. Your death still doesn't make sense. It never will. I'm home now. I'm going to college. I'm trying to build a life. But you're always there, in the back of my mind, a weight I carry everywhere I go. From his 40s, after becoming a father. Dear Bobo, I have a son now. Marcus. He's 5 years old, and he's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And I'm terrified every single day. Terrified that the world will do to him what it did to you. That being black and male and alive is enough to get him killed. That I watch him sleep sometimes, and I think about your mama. About how she loved you and lost you and had to find a way to keep living. I don't know how she did it. I don't know how any parent survives losing their child that way. From his 70s, after Lorraine died. Dear Bobo, my wife passed. Cancer. She was good to me, patient with me, even though she knew I was carrying something I couldn't share. I wish I'd told her. I wish I'd told someone. This secret has been like cancer itself, eating away at me from the inside. That I'm old now, Bobo. You're still 14. You'll always be 14. Sometimes I wonder what kind of man you would have become. Would you have been a father? A grandfather? Would you have lived to see Obama become president? Would you have believed it was possible? And the final letter, written just weeks before Elijah died. Dear Bobo, I'm dying. Cancer, like everyone else in my family. But before I go, I want you to know I told the truth. I finally told someone what I saw, what they did to you. Every horrible detail. It's on record now. It's part of history. You're not just a photograph anymore. You're not just a symbol. People know the whole story now, or as much of it as I could remember. I hope that matters. I hope that wherever you are, if there's anywhere to be after this life, I hope you know that I didn't forget. I never forgot. I carried you with me every day of my life. I'll see you soon, cousin. And maybe on the other side, you can tell me whether I did the right thing. Whether speaking truth 68 years late was better than never speaking at all. Your cousin always. Elijah. Clara read these letters with tears streaming down her face. She showed them to Jasmine, who asked permission to include them in the second edition of her book. Clara agreed. These letters deserve to be part of the historical record too. Not just the facts of what happened that night, but the emotional cost of witnessing it. The way trauma echoes through a lifetime. In 2027, the Emmett Till Interpretive Center in Sumner, Mississippi, dedicated an entire wing to Elijah Montgomery's testimony. The exhibit was called The Weight of Witness, Trauma, Silence, and Delayed Justice. It included audio recordings of Elijah's interviews with Jasmine, photographs of him at different ages, copies of the letters he'd written to Emmett, a video of his return to Mississippi, standing at the Tallahatchie River, Testimonies from psychologists explaining how trauma affects memory and disclosure. Context about the culture of fear that kept so many witnesses silent during the Jim Crow era. But the centerpiece of the exhibit was a recreation of the sweet gum tree that Elijah had hidden in that night. Not the actual tree, that was long gone, but an artistic representation. A massive sculpture made of metal and wood, its branches reaching toward the ceiling, its trunk hollow so visitors could step inside and see through the gaps as Elijah had. From inside the tree sculpture, visitors could see a video projection showing the barn, the river, the cotton fields, all the places Elijah's story had taken place. They could hear his voice describing what he'd witnessed. They could, for just a moment, understand what it meant to be 12 years old and trapped between the need to see and the need to stay hidden, between the instinct to speak and the necessity of silence. The exhibit was powerful, visceral, emotionally devastating. School groups toured it. Families traveled from around the country to see it. Foreign visitors came to understand American racial history. More than one person left in tears. The museum director, Dr. Kimberly James, said in an interview, "Elijah Montgomery's testimony shows us that witness is complicated. We want our heroes to be perfect, to speak immediately, to show no fear, to prioritize truth over survival. But real people are more complex than that. Real people are traumatized. Real people are afraid. Real people sometimes need decades to process horror before they can speak about it. And that's okay. That's human. And ultimately, speaking late is still speaking. Truth delayed is still truth." Elijah's grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up knowing they were part of history. At family gatherings, they would sometimes talk about their grandfather, about his courage in finally speaking, about the burden he'd carried for so long. His oldest grandson, Elijah Jr., named after him, became a civil rights lawyer. He worked on cases involving police brutality and wrongful death, seeking justice for families whose loved ones had been killed. He often thought about his grandfather, about the way systemic racism created situations where speaking truth could get you killed, where silence was survival, where justice was a luxury few could afford. "My grandfather taught me that heroism isn't always loud," Elijah Jr. said in an interview for Black History Month. "Sometimes heroism is quiet. Sometimes it's surviving when everything in the world wants you to die. Sometimes it's living with unbearable knowledge and somehow not being destroyed by it. And sometimes it's finding your voice at 93 years old and using whatever time you have left to tell the truth. Consequences be damned." His granddaughter Jasmine, named not after the reporter but by coincidence, became a therapist specializing in intergenerational trauma. She worked with families dealing with the psychological aftermath of racial violence, helping them understand that trauma doesn't end with the person who experienced it directly. It ripples outward and downward, affecting children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who never witnessed the original trauma but carry its weight nonetheless. "My grandfather never talked to us about what he'd witnessed," she said in a presentation at a psychology conference. "Not when we were growing up. But we knew something was there. We could feel it. The way he'd sometimes go quiet in the middle of a sentence, the nightmares he had even in his 80s, the way he'd tear up for no apparent reason. Trauma leaves a mark, even when, especially when, it can't be spoken about. Part of my work is helping families name these invisible wounds, to understand that silence around trauma doesn't protect children. It just teaches them that some things are too terrible to talk about, which makes them carry those things in isolation." On August 28, 2025, exactly 70 years after Emmett Till's murder and 7 months after Elijah's death, a major commemoration was held in Mississippi. Representatives from the Till family, the Montgomery family, civil rights organizations, elected officials, and thousands of ordinary citizens gathered at the Tallahatchie River. President Harris gave a speech acknowledging the federal government's historical failure to protect Black citizens from racial violence. She announced a new initiative to investigate unsolved civil rights-era murders, to find witnesses while they were still alive, to create a complete historical record before everyone who remembered was gone. Elijah Montgomery's testimony came late, Harris said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Some might say too late. The men who killed Emmett Till never faced justice. Carolyn Bryant never faced consequences for her lies. But Elijah's testimony still matters. It matters because truth always matters. It matters because the historical record is more complete now. It matters because it gives other witnesses permission to speak, to unburden themselves before they die. It matters because Emmett Till is not just a symbol now, but a real boy with a real story, remembered in all his fullness because his cousin had the courage to finally speak. At the river's edge, a memorial was unveiled. A bronze statue of a young boy, not meant to be Emmett specifically, but representing all the young black victims of racial violence, standing with his head high, his eyes looking toward the horizon. Beside him, a bronze sweet gum tree with a small plaque that read, "In memory of Elijah Montgomery, 1943 to 2025, who witnessed the unthinkable, carried it for 68 years, and finally gave voice to truth. Late testimony is still testimony. Families tossed flowers into the river, sunflowers, like the ones Jasmine had brought Elijah in his final days. The bright yellow blooms floated on the dark water, carried downstream, beautiful and temporary and fragile, like memory itself. Come on, please don't forget to like and subscribe.